June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. The largest invasion in human history has begun. 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft, pour across the Soviet border. The Wehrmacht is confident, battle-hardened, and equipped with what they believe are the finest weapons in the world. Their panzer divisions, the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, slice through Soviet defenses. Among their arsenal is the workhorse anti-tank gun, the 5 cm Pak 38. A weapon that had mastered every battlefield from France to the Balkans. Its crews are elite, disciplined, and lethal. But on a dusty road near the village of WWII in Lithuania, that confidence is about to shatter against a new, terrifying reality. A column of the 6th Panzer Division advances, their 50 mm guns primed for action. Their scouts report enemy armor ahead. The crews deploy, range the target. A solitary, unfamiliar Soviet tank, its silhouette angular and strange. Distance, 100 meters. Point-blank range. A guaranteed kill. The gunner breathes out, squeezes the trigger. The shell screams across the short distance, and ricochets into the sky with a sickening, metallic shriek. How could a German 50 mm gun at a mere 100 meters fail? This was the first shocking encounter with a secret that would redefine tank warfare. The T-34 and its revolutionary sloped armor. This is not just a story of steel and ballistics. It is the story of a technological shock that stunned the most powerful army on Earth, and the men who faced a machine that, for a terrifying moment, seemed utterly invincible. To understand the shock, we must first understand the men who delivered it. The crew of that lone T-34, part of the Soviet 2nd Tank Division, were likely as surprised as the Germans. Their unit, like much of the Red Army in the Western military districts, was caught in chaos. Stalin's refusal to believe invasion was imminent had left units under strength, on low alert, and often without adequate ammunition. But they had one advantage they did not yet fully comprehend: their tank. The T-34 medium tank, entering service in 1940, was a masterpiece of armored design born from the brilliant minds of Mikhail Koshkin and his team. Its secret was not just thicker armor, but smarter armor. While German tanks of the time, like the Panzer III and IV, featured largely vertical armor plates, the T-34's hull was sloped at a 60-degree angle. This geometry was revolutionary. A shell striking sloped armor must penetrate a greater effective thickness of steel. Think of it not as punching through a wall, but trying to stab through a heavily angled roof. The slope also increased the chance of a ricochet. Combined with a powerful 76.2 mm high-velocity gun and wide tracks for superior mobility in Russian mud and snow, the T-34 was, on paper, the world's most advanced tank. Yet, in Berlin, intelligence on the T-34 was dismissed or ignored. German command, imbued with a sense of racial and technological superiority, believed Soviet armor to be crude, obsolete, and poorly handled. The panzer crews rolling into Russia in June 1941 shared this arrogance. They were the victors of Europe. Their standard anti-tank gun, the 5 cm Pak 38, firing the PZGR 39 armor-piercing shell, had a listed penetration of 69 mm of vertical armor at 100 meters. Soviet tanks they had seen before, like the BT series or the T-26, had armor no thicker than 25 mm. This should have been easy. But the men of the 6th Panzer Division, part of Army Group North's thrust towards Leningrad, were about to collide with the future. And in that moment near WWII, the entire trajectory of the war on the Eastern Front, the so-called Panzerkampf, hinged on a simple, brutal question of physics and steel. The first encounters were fragmented, confused, and deeply traumatic for the Germans. Reports flooded back to battalion and regimental command posts that defied belief. Our shots are simply bouncing off. The enemy tank is invulnerable from the front. 50 mm shells have no effect. A palpable unease began to spread through the ranks of the Panzerjäger, the anti-tank crews. Let's examine the exact scenario. A Pak 38 crew spots a T-34 at 100 meters, well within what the gunners called Nahkampfbereich, the close combat range. The crew swings into action with practiced efficiency. The loader slams a 5 kg armor-piercing round into the breech. Geladen. The gunner, peering through his ZF-3X8 sight, centers the crosshairs on the center of mass of the approaching tank. The command rings out, "Fewer." The gun cracks, the violent recoil shaking the carriage. Through the gun smoke they watch. They see the flash of impact on the T-34's glassy plate, and then a bright spark as the shell deflects harmlessly skyward. The tank, seemingly unfazed, continues its advance. The reason was a devastating mathematical reality. The T-34's front hull armor was 45 mm thick. But because it was sloped back at 60 degrees, the line of sight thickness, the amount of steel a shell actually had to travel through, became not 45 mm, but over 90 mm. The 50 mm pack shell, capable of defeating 69 mm, was physically incapable of punching through. It was like throwing a pebble against a sharply angled slate roof. Even if it didn't ricochet, it lacked the kinetic force. The crisis deepened for the panzer divisions themselves. The standard tank of the German medium companies, the Panzer III Ausf. F or G, was armed with a short-barreled 5 cm KWK 38L/42 gun. Its performance was similar to the Pak 38. In a direct duel, a Panzer III crew would find their shots glancing off the T-34, while the Soviet tank's 76 mm gun could punch clean through a Panzer III's 30 to 50 mm of mostly vertical armor at over 1,000 meters. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. A sense of technical inferiority unheard of in the Wehrmacht took root. Fear gripped the men. They began to speak of the T-34 crisis, the T-34 crisis. By early July 1941, just weeks into the campaign, the reports were no longer anecdotes but a systemic threat. General Erich von Manstein, commanding the LVI Panzer Corps, wrote of the disadvantages in weaponry and armor faced by his panzers. A German after-action report from the 1st Panzer Division stated bleakly, "The T-34 is vastly superior to all German tanks in armor, arming and cross-country mobility." The invincible spearhead of the Blitzkrieg was blunting itself on the sloped armor of a tank they had not believed could exist. The summer of 1941 became a desperate scramble for solutions against an enemy that, tactically often in disarray, possessed this terrifying technical edge. German units developed ad hoc, perilous tactics born of sheer desperation. The standard operating procedure for engaging a T-34 became a litany of lethal risk. Pak 38 crews were ordered to hold their fire until the last possible moment, aiming for the few vulnerable spots. The turret ring where a lucky shot could jam the rotation, the driver's visor slot, or the relatively flat gun mantlet. But hitting these small moving targets under the immense stress of combat, with a 30-ton behemoth bearing down on you, was a task for the supremely brave or the doomed. More often, crews had to let the T-34 overrun their position, hoping to survive the crushing treads, so they could engage its thinner rear armor as it passed. The casualty rates among anti-tank units spiked. For German tankers, the situation was just as dire. Panzer III commanders resorted to tactical ambushes, using terrain to hide their inferior machines. They would lie in wait, often in hull-down positions if possible, and attempt to flank the T-34s to hit their side armor. A direct frontal assault was tantamount to suicide. The emotional toll was immense. Veteran crews who had swept across Europe with confidence now felt vulnerable, outgunned. The bitterness of the Russian summer dust was matched by the bitter taste of fear. The crisis reached its peak in the battles around Mtsensk in October 1941. Here, the 4th Panzer Division, part of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group advancing on Moscow, encountered a Soviet counterattack led by fresh T-34s from the 1st Guards Rifle Corps. In a series of brutal engagements, German anti-tank screens were simply plowed under. Pak 38s fired, ricocheted, and were silenced by high-explosive rounds or crushed under treads. The narrative of inevitable German victory was cracking. The T-34, in the hands of a determined crew, was a fortress on tracks. An infamous German report from this period captured the despair. The 5 cm anti-tank gun is effective against the T-34 only at ranges under 100 meters, and then only against the rear and side armor. Engagement of the frontal armor is hopeless. Our panzers can only successfully combat the T-34 from the flank, and even then only at short ranges. They were confessing that their primary anti-tank weapon at point-blank range could not kill the enemy's main tank from the front. The Wehrmacht was facing a technological abyss, and the road to Moscow was paved with the wreckage of their assumptions. Yet, the German war machine was nothing if not adaptable. The shock of the T-34 triggered a frantic, two-pronged response. Immediate battlefield improvisation and a crash program for new weapon systems. The days of easy victories were over. The war on the Eastern Front became a brutal contest of engineering and will. On the ground, soldiers turned to whatever weapons could fill the gap. The first and most critical stopgap was the legendary 8.8 cm Flak 1836. Originally an anti-aircraft gun, its high-velocity, high-explosive round could devastate a T-34 at long range. Flak units were rushed to the front lines in a ground roll. Setting up the massive, cumbersome gun under fire was a nightmare, but its bark was unmistakable and its effect decisive. It was the only weapon readily available in 1941 that could reliably stop a T-34 from a safe distance. The myth of the 88 was born in the snow and mud of Russia, out of sheer necessity. Simultaneously, anti-tank crews were issued new specialized ammunition for the Pak-38. The Panzergranate 40, PZger 40, a tungsten-cored high-velocity round, offered significantly better penetration. But tungsten was desperately scarce in Germany, and the rounds were in short supply, reserved for only the most critical threats. More common was the whole grenade or shaped charge round, which did not rely on kinetic energy but a focused explosive jet. While it could penetrate the T-34's armor regardless of slope, early models were unreliable and required a direct, square hit. But the true turning point was the rapid acceleration of German tank and anti-tank gun development. The Panzer III was upgunned with the longer, more powerful 5 cm KWK 39L/60. The Panzer IV, originally an infantry support vehicle, was radically redesigned to become the main anti-tank platform, armed with the superb 7.5 cm KWK 40. And emerging from the factories came the first of the heavy tanks, the Tiger I with its 8.8 cm KWK 36, a gun born from the flak experience. On the anti-tank gun front, the 7.5 cm Pak 40, entering service in late 1941 and becoming widespread in 1942, finally gave infantry units a weapon that could confidently engage the T-34 head-on at standard combat ranges. The psychological turning point came not with a single battle, but with this gradual re-equipment. By the time of the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the technological balance had shifted. German units were fielding Panthers, Tigers, Pak-40s, and vast numbers of 88s. The T-34 was no longer a terrifying specter, but a respected, and now vulnerable, opponent. The secret of its sloped armor had been cracked not by a single genius, but by the brutal, industrial logic of total war: find a bigger gun. So, what was the outcome of that first shocking encounter at 100 meters? In the immediate tactical sense, that lone T-34 at WWII likely met its end. It was immobilized, flanked, or destroyed by a shot to its weaker side, or overwhelmed by artillery or infantry close assault. The Battle of WWII was a German victory. But strategically, the shockwave from that ricochet traveled all the way to Berlin and reshaped the war. The failure of the 50 mm gun exposed a fatal complacency in German intelligence and technical preparation. It forced the Wehrmacht into a costly and continuous arms race, diverting precious resources into complex, over-engineered tanks like the Tiger and Panther, while Soviet industry churned out simpler, more reliable T-34s by the tens of thousands. The T-34's design legacy, however, is its true victory. The principle of sloped armor became the universal standard for all future tank design, from the German Panther itself, which copied the T-34's sloped glacis, to modern main battle tanks. The human cost was staggering. The crews on both sides paid the price for this technological duel. Soviet tankers, often poorly trained and sent into battle with tragic bravery, suffered catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, in part because their superior machines were often misused. German anti-tank crews, ordered to stand firm with inadequate weapons against the T-34 terror, earned a fearsome reputation for courage and sustained horrific casualties. Their heroism was recognized with Knight's Crosses awarded for the destruction of multiple tanks in single engagements, a testament to how desperate and personal this duel had become. In the end, the story of the 50 mm gun's failure is not a story of German weakness, but of Soviet engineering vision. It is the moment the paradigm shifted. Warfare is not just about the will of soldiers but the quality of their tools. On that June day in 1941, a single sheet of angled steel proved that a brilliant design could, even if only for a season, defy the might of an empire. The T-34's secret was out and tank warfare would never be the same. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War, a clash where physics and fear met on a dusty road. Subscribe to World War II Vault as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.